And the other episodes you talk about in the book are pretty much equally shocking examples of the New York Times getting major atrocity, the reporting of major atrocities wrong, things that are just not even controversial anymore, like the idea that there was a famine in the Ukraine that killed, I'm not exactly sure what the number is, but
between 5 and 7 million.
Right, but between the Holodomor, as they call it, the notion that that happened is not at all controversial and hasn't been for a long time. But the New York Times was on the wrong side of that one, and the treatment of Fidel Castro you talk about. Yep. You also talk about more recent errors that are kind of more often talked about, such as whether Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and this kind of stuff. And you also you end by discussing the 1619 project and the factual errors about American history that have been allowed to remain, and you tie these all together as examples of the paper of record, probably the most respected still paper in America and one of the most respected papers around the world, getting large things wrong and seeming to not suffer a serious reputational price for that. I think it's definitely true in the past few years that the New York Times has lost authority with a lot of readers. I don't know how much a lot is, but definitely the audience of this podcast is you're going to be preaching to the choir probably in terms of talking to smart people that nevertheless doubt the New York Times, not because they're generally conspiratorial or they think everything is a lie and chemtrails blah blah blah, but because they've observed a pattern of mistakes that are deep enough and damning enough to make you doubt the system that's continually making those mistakes. Yeah, can you, I guess one question I had reading this book is about the sense of authority that the New York Times has. And authority is an interesting concept because it's something that it's a little bit hard to describe exactly what it is, but it's just the sense that people believe what you're saying because of who they know you to be. When you're a kid, your parents have authority. They seem to be masters of the world and they just understand everything so much better than you. And as you part of becoming an adult is your parents lose authority and you gain it. But it's not something that you just turn a switch and someone loses. And there's also this problem of everyone knows that arguments from authority are technically a fallacy, right? To say that X is true because Y said it is just like fallacy, illogic 101. But at the same time, it's a practical necessity to rely on arguments from authority sometimes, because the chain has to stop somewhere. If someone keeps asking why, and you're a normal person, you have to say, well, because I read it in a scientific paper and I trust that they're not lying. I trust that they didn't fabricate their data, or I trust that the fact checkers, I trust that the buck has to stop somewhere and someone's being truthful because, so I guess one question I had reading this is, given that the New York Times has made egregious errors of the kind that would probably permanently stain most institutions, why has it sort of retained this sense of legitimacy and authority to the degree that it has?
That's a great question, and that's the weird twist here, is that when you start to really look at all the stuff all these different episodes that I report on in my book, other things that people are catching on to, other journalists are criticizing for errors or misreporting or online. What you start to understand is that the New York Times has succeeded because of those things. It succeeds, and those things happen because of its drive to succeed, to be number one, more specifically. They have been, when you go and look through what has been the through line of all these different things, the World War II reporting that I mentioned, which was very, very sympathetic to the Nazis, calling the Berlin Olympics, the Nazi Olympics, the greatest sporting event of all time, calling Hitler, or saying he was actuated by a lofty and unselfish patriotism, calling the Munich Accords a freshening breeze across a conference table. And that's just one of these episodes. But what connects them all is that the New York Times was always willing, not just willing, compelled to do whatever it takes to get the best scoops. And that's why they kept this Nazi sympathizing Berlin bureau chief in place, even though they knew what he was, because they knew he had the best access. And that was, of course, because the Nazis loved him. When you look at, weapons of mass destruction, what drove that hyperventilation by the New York Times over WMDs in Iraq, when there was never any good sourcing to believe there was that they had a new editor who was determined to increase the newspaper's, what he called, competitive metabolism, to make them number one. And for them, they were at a turning point where they were going from being a metropolitan, somewhat regional newspaper to a national newspaper. And that was about being number one in the United States, because they understood correctly that in this new future in which we have the internet, thousands of other sources, there would be only one real major player, and they were going to be it. And that if that meant having to report falsely on WMDs to get the scoop, then let's just take the risk. If that meant then having Jason Blair and a series of other reporters after this swing the pendulum back in the other way, in some cases by claiming that veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan were homicidal maniacs, despite there being no evidence or data to support that whatsoever, they would do that too, because that was about the brand. Again and again and again, and that goes back even to the Soviet Union and the Ukraine famine. They were willing to do what it took to get those scoops. And Walter Duranty, who's the New York Times Russia correspondent that actually did the cover-up, he got a personal invitation as an American journalist from Joseph Stalin to interview Stalin. And that was like getting a one-on-one interview with Kim Jong-un, times 10. It was all about access. And there was also a financial consideration in that particular case as well, which we can touch on later. But that's why, is because they have invested so much in staying number one, including in many cases their integrity, that they achieve that. Where other newspapers and news organizations were not willing to go that far. They were not willing to work hand in hand with the Soviet Union, and then 10 years later, essentially do the same thing with the Nazis, and 10 years later with Fidel Castro in Cuba, and 10 years later in Vietnam. So that's essentially the reason.
So I guess that may partly answer the question, but why the New York Times? What separates the New York Times here? Is it just that they are the top dog in this space and that's why you're interested in focusing on them? Or is there some other thing that separates them from their major competitors like the Wall Street Journal and so forth?
The New York Times, I think there's two things here. The New York Times is, of course, the most powerful news organization in America, and maybe pound for pound the most powerful, most influential news brand in the world. I mean, you can go all around the world and talk about the New York Times and people will be like, yeah, I know what that is. You're not necessarily going to get that kind of brand resonance with the Financial Times or even to some extent the BBC. This is an icon. And it is also the flagship news outlet of the American media. It's got twice as many Pulitzer Prizes as its next closest competitor, the Washington Post. It is the pinnacle for journalists. That's where they want to be. It's where they want to spend their careers if they can. And that, again, it's that level of influence that makes it truly unique, that they're able to not just set the policy agenda, set the news agenda, but they're essentially shaping reality. I mean, they are syndicated and licensed to thousands of other news organizations around the globe, and they just command that respect and power among the right people. But on the other side, the second part of that is what this reveals as well. I mean, that's part of the cause, but what does this show us? And partly, I think, for me, is that the New York Times is really the template of corporate media. They really had perfected that structure of news for profit that is controlled by a single family. And that's also what makes it unique. Still today, this is a dynasty that stretches back 120 years from the founders, a man named Adolf Ochs, a German Jew who immigrated to America. So from this one, the pioneer of the dynasty, right through today, the Sulzbergers, who not just control the newspaper, but actually are actively involved as publisher. The current heir to the throne, A.G. Sulzberger, is the publisher of the newspaper and the chairman of the New York Times Company. So that shows you a lot about how corporate media works. And when you're analyzing stories today, really big stuff like the pandemic and lab leak and the Steele dossier, and you see it through the prism of this one unique news organization that has so much power and influence and has this corporate media structure, you really learn a lot about how these things work and what the incentives are and where things go wrong and where the safety mechanisms completely fail. So that, to me, is why I started, and it's also why I continue to look through the New York Times lens.